Under the gleaming dome of the Galactic Academy, where light refracted through crystalline walls and the hum of distant machinery blended with the quiet murmur of students preparing for their trial, the atmosphere in the classroom felt heavier than usual. The air carried tension, an invisible pressure that made every cadet shift nervously in his or her seat. Among the ranks of reptilian, insectoid, and crystalline students sat the lone human cadet, a young man named Elias. His presence had always been a point of curiosity. Some regarded him as fragile, a creature unsuited for the rigors of galactic survival. Others saw him as a strange anomaly, a representative of a species known for unpredictable resilience. For weeks, whispers had followed him down the corridors, muttered behind armored mandibles or flicking antennae. "Too soft," one alien muttered once. "Too breakable," another hissed. "He will never pass the course." Elias heard them all but chose silence as his shield. He focused instead on the lessons, scribbling notes in his weathered notebook, while others relied on memory implants and data chips. He preferred the act of writing, the scratch of pen against paper grounding him in a place where technology often stripped away the tactile and the real. The day of the practical exercise arrived, an assessment designed to test not strength or combat ability, but resourcefulness. The class was ushered into a large chamber where a simulation of a survival environment stretched across the floor, complete with artificial heat, soil flown in from hostile worlds, and flora cultivated to mimic alien ecologies. At the center of the chamber sat a simple object, a canteen of water, glistening under the artificial sun. The instructors offered no explanation beyond the command to observe, adapt, survive. The cadets exchanged glances, some uneasy, others calculating. Water was survival, but nothing at the academy was ever so straightforward. Elias looked at the canteen once, then turned his gaze away, not eager to reveal his intentions too quickly. What he did not know was that a small group of cadets had spent the previous night conspiring. A reptilian youth named Krishak, resentful of the quiet human who seemed unbothered by insults, had taken it upon himself to expose Elias as weak. He, along with two others, decided to tamper with the water supply. To them, it was a brilliant move. Spike the canteen with a toxin deadly to most cadets, but calculated to appear harmless in small doses. The oversight in their plan was rooted in arrogance. They never fully understood how human biology differed from their own. To them, Elias was delicate, almost laughable in his physiology. None considered that what could kill them might flow harmlessly through his veins. As the cadets filed into the chamber, Krishak's scaled lips curled into a grin, his eyes flicking toward the canteen as if daring Elias to approach. The crystalline student beside him reflected the room's light in sharp, angular flares, her gaze locked onto the human with an almost predatory anticipation. A hushed energy settled among the conspirators. The trap was set, the bait gleaming in plain sight, and the outcome, so they believed, would humiliate the human and prove once and for all that his kind did not belong in the academy. Elias, however, was not oblivious. He noticed how certain cadets exchanged glances, how whispers carried the faintest trace of excitement that had little to do with the assignment. He had grown accustomed to being the target of ridicule, but this time the undercurrent felt different, sharper. His instincts, honed not by training in advanced academies, but by a childhood of cautious observation, warned him that the test before him was not merely about water or survival. It was about him. The realization did not frighten him. Instead, it stirred a calm determination. If the challenge was meant to expose his weakness, then perhaps the best response was to show a strength none of them expected. The instructors stood silently along the perimeter, their expressions unreadable. Some wore sealed breathing masks, others communicated in subtle gestures and pheromones, but all shared a single intent: to watch. The room itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, the hum of hidden machinery providing the backdrop to a drama that had yet to unfold. Elias stepped forward slowly, his boots crunching against the gritty soil of the simulated terrain. Each step seemed louder than it should have, echoing in the ears of those who watched with rapt attention. His hand brushed against his notebook tucked into his belt, a reminder of the thoughts and patterns he had recorded. Observations of flora toxicity, notes on alien dietary tolerances, sketches of roots and leaves that could sustain or kill. He knew knowledge was his strongest weapon here, not muscle or intimidation. The canteen stood in the open, unguarded yet ominous. Its surface reflected the simulated sun, sending flashes of light across the walls. Elias crouched near it, examining the container with quiet focus. He noted the faint residue on the rim, the slight discoloration of the liquid that would escape the notice of anyone less observant. His suspicion sharpened, though he betrayed no sign of it outwardly. Instead, he allowed his expression to remain calm, even faintly curious, as if the only thing on his mind was thirst. Behind him, the conspirators shifted in their positions, watching closely. Krishak's claws twitched against the dirt, impatient for the moment of triumph. He could almost hear the gasps of his peers, the collapse of the human, the vindication of his scorn. Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the metal surface of the canteen. The coolness of the container bit against his skin, and he lifted it slowly, deliberately. A silence descended over the chamber. Cadets stopped whispering. Instructors leaned forward ever so slightly. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the choice that would determine the course of the exercise. Would Elias recognize the danger? Would he hesitate and reveal himself as cautious to the point of weakness? Or would he drink and seal his fate? Elias lifted the canteen to his lips, but before the liquid touched his mouth, he paused for the briefest heartbeat. In that pause, he weighed more than water. He weighed the distrust that had always clung to him here, the prejudice that shadowed every step, the challenge of proving himself without descending into bitterness. He decided in that moment that if his peers wished to test him, then he would not shrink from their challenge. He tilted the canteen, and the poisoned liquid flowed over his tongue, cool and metallic. He swallowed without flinching, his face impassive. Then he lowered the container, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and set the canteen back down with a soft clink that echoed louder than thunder to those who had plotted against him. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on every cadet present. Eyes widened, mandibles froze mid-clack, antennae stiffened in disbelief. The conspirators' confidence cracked, fear flickering across their faces as they realized the trap had not sprung as expected. Elias stood calmly, his posture relaxed, his pulse steady, his expression unreadable. In that moment, he was no longer the fragile outsider. He was something else, something the cadets could not yet name, but could no longer dismiss. The stage was set, though the true lesson of this act had yet to unfold. The moment after Elias set the canteen down stretched into a silence that seemed almost unnatural. The air no longer carried the faint whispers and shifting feet of uneasy students. Instead, it felt as though the chamber itself had frozen, caught in the gravity of what had just occurred. His calmness unsettled everyone. Every cadet present had anticipated some visible effect, some outward sign that the human had been struck down by his own carelessness. Instead, Elias stood with an expression as steady as stone, his chest rising and falling with the same even rhythm it always had. The instructors remained statues at the edge of the room, their eyes fixed on him, allowing the weight of the moment to grow. What unsettled the watching cadets most was not his act of drinking, but the fact that he appeared unchanged. No signs of weakness, no hesitation, only composure. Krishak, who had orchestrated the plot with such smug confidence, shifted uneasily, his scaled hand pressing into the dirt until his claws left small trenches. The crystalline student beside him reflected faint shards of light across the chamber, her angular form flickering as she fidgeted with uncertainty. This was not the outcome she had envisioned when she agreed to tamper with the canteen. She had expected laughter, humiliation, perhaps even a medical emergency that would have removed Elias from the program. Instead, the human's apparent indifference twisted the trap into something unpredictable. Krishak's mind raced. Could the toxin have failed? Was the dosage too low? Or had human physiology once again betrayed assumptions made about it? Elias did not speak. He remained quiet, his eyes scanning the room, not with arrogance, but with a steady awareness that unsettled those who had plotted against him. He was no longer the subject of ridicule in this moment. He was a mirror that reflected the cadets' own doubt back at them. Some of the students who had not participated in the scheme exchanged worried glances, as though wondering if they themselves had been complicit simply by remaining silent. The entire class seemed caught between fascination and dread. The silence shattered when one insectoid cadet, his long limbs trembling, broke into a whisper that carried across the room. "Why is he still standing?" The question was not meant to be answered, but it struck the conspirators like a blade. The human should have been on the ground, or at the very least coughing and retching. Instead, he stood taller than he had before, his posture steady, his gaze unwavering. Krishak hissed under his breath, his confidence draining as he realized that what was meant to humiliate had instead elevated Elias into something more dangerous, a symbol of defiance. Elias turned slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the cadets who stared at him in disbelief. He did not speak, but his silence had a language of its own. It said, "I know what you attempted, and it has failed." He knew without confirmation that the canteen had been tampered with, and he also knew that those who had orchestrated the scheme were now drowning in fear of exposure. His calmness had transformed the trap into a spectacle, and the spectacle into a test of character, not for him, but for the ones who had plotted. The instructors remained motionless, as though weighing the unfolding drama. Elias sensed their restraint. He understood that they would not intervene unless the situation spiraled beyond control. This was not only his trial, it was theirs as well. The Academy sought to measure not only physical resilience, but also psychological endurance, leadership under pressure, and the ability to respond to deceit. Elias had turned an act of sabotage into a new kind of examination, one that no one had anticipated. Krishak tried to compose himself, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing with a flicker of desperation. He wanted to speak, to dismiss the moment as luck or coincidence, but the words caught in his throat. If he accused the human of trickery, he risked revealing his own involvement. If he remained silent, he surrendered the room to Elias's presence. The crystalline student shifted nervously, her angular body refracting light that danced along the chamber walls, betraying her anxiety. The silence around her became unbearable, a weight that pressed against her core. She clenched her hands together to still the trembling that betrayed her fear. Elias took a slow step forward, the sound of his boot crunching against the dirt echoing through the room. The conspirators flinched as if the sound itself carried judgment. He did not look at them directly, but his eyes lingered on their side of the room long enough to make them feel exposed. He had no need to accuse. His calm demeanor placed the burden of guilt upon them without a single word. The cadets who had not participated in the plot began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of awe and confusion. Some began to wonder if the human had been aware of the poison all along, if he had anticipated the attempt and chosen to demonstrate his resilience rather than reveal the trick. The instructors exchanged glances. One of them, a tall figure clad in armor that shimmered faintly with protective fields, tilted his head slightly as though considering the implications of what had transpired. The others remained stoic, their faces unreadable, but their silence was telling. They had not stopped the act, and now they were letting the aftermath unfold. Elias could feel the shift in the room. He had become the center, not because of strength or intimidation, but because of the calm authority that radiated from his choice to act without fear. Krishak's claws tapped against the ground, a staccato rhythm betraying his impatience. He wanted desperately to regain control, to remind the others of the danger the toxin should have posed. Yet the human's composure silenced him. Every possible argument he could make seemed hollow when weighed against the reality that Elias was still standing, unbroken and unafraid. The crystalline student's light flickered erratically, her nerves fraying under the gaze of her peers. She had agreed to the plot in confidence, but now that confidence had dissolved into shame. Elias finally moved again, walking slowly toward the back of the chamber. His pace was unhurried, his expression unreadable. Each step was measured, as though he was not walking away from danger but carrying it with him. His presence no longer seemed fragile or out of place. Instead, it was commanding, quietly reshaping the perception of every cadet who had once dismissed him. His silence had spoken louder than any declaration, and the poisoned water had become not a trap for him, but a trap for those who had set it. The weight of the moment settled over the conspirators, pressing them deeper into unease. They had expected triumph, but what lingered now was the shadow of exposure. The instructor's silence only deepened the uncertainty, for none could tell whether they had condoned the act or were simply waiting for the lesson to fully unfold. Elias knew this was only the beginning. He could feel the tension building, the inevitability that soon words would be demanded, explanations required, and truth revealed. He had not only survived their trap, but inverted it. What began as an attempt to humiliate him had become the foundation of a lesson he was now poised to teach. And so the chamber remained heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of machinery and the distant pulse of light through crystalline walls. The cadets shifted uneasily, their expectations shattered, their certainty dissolving into fear and awe. The instructors watched. Elias stood steady. The poisoned canteen, once a symbol of deceit, now gleamed on the table as a silent witness to the failure of arrogance. The trap had been set, the human had walked into it, and yet he emerged not weakened, but transformed into something greater. The cadets did not yet understand how this moment would change the course of their training, but Elias did. He had already begun to see the path ahead, and he knew the next step would not be silence, but revelation. The silence that followed Elias's steady departure from the canteen had the weight of something monumental, as though the entire chamber had shifted around a new axis. Every cadet stared at him, searching for even the smallest tremor in his hand, the faintest falter in his step, but nothing came. His calm movements only deepened the strangeness of what they had witnessed, and with every passing second, the tension sharpened into disbelief that bordered on fear. The instructors had not intervened, and the poisoned canteen remained untouched by anyone else, gleaming like a silent accusation in the artificial sunlight. The room felt frozen, but inside each cadet's mind, chaos reigned. The insectoid student who had whispered earlier now clutched his arms tightly across his thorax, clicking his mandibles nervously as his compound eyes darted toward Krishak. His posture screamed the question he dared not voice aloud. What had gone wrong? The crystalline cadet shifted restlessly, her faceted body refracting fractured rays of light that danced wildly along the chamber's walls, betraying the tremors coursing through her. She was unraveling under the gaze of her peers, caught between shame and terror. Krishak's chest rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. He knew he had engineered this trap with precision. He knew the toxin was real, the dosage effective. He had envisioned Elias writhing, collapsing, or at least weakened enough to strip away the human's air of composure. Instead, Elias stood as if nothing had happened, and now the spotlight that Krishak had planned to use for humiliation illuminated only his own growing panic. Elias turned slowly, and in that simple act, he seemed to seize the room's attention completely. His gaze swept across the faces of his classmates, not in condemnation, but with an unsettling calm that revealed no trace of anger or fear. His silence was louder than any accusation. He understood that if he named the conspirators now, the instructors might intervene, the cadets might turn on one another, and the moment would dissolve into chaos. Instead, he chose to let silence work for him, letting guilt rise unchallenged in the hearts of those who had plotted. It was a calculated stillness, the kind that drew every eye to him and left every student questioning his thoughts. The longer he remained unchanged, the more the shock grew. A cadet with scaled armor muttered something under his breath, a sound more hiss than word, and another cadet pulled his cloak tighter around his body, as though afraid that proximity to Elias carried danger. Even those who had no hand in the plot began to feel a strange unease, as though the human had stepped outside the rules of the exercise. He had consumed poison and yet remained unharmed. Was this resilience? Was this defiance? Or was it something far stranger that none of them yet understood? Krishak's nerves broke first. He slammed his clawed hand against the ground, his voice rising above the heavy silence. "This is not possible," he hissed, his eyes flashing with a mixture of rage and fear. The words hung in the air, brittle and desperate. Several heads turned toward him instantly, their gazes narrowing with suspicion. He realized too late the mistake in his outburst. His frustration betrayed his knowledge he should not have possessed unless he had been involved in the tampering. The crystalline cadet beside him stiffened, her light flickering erratically, her silence now damning her by association. Elias did not move to confront him. He only stood there, his posture unyielding, his calm expression leaving Krishak's fury to expose itself unchecked. The instructors exchanged subtle glances, but still none spoke. Their restraint only heightened the pressure within the chamber. It was as though they were waiting for the cadets to confront the truth themselves, allowing the poisoned water to become a catalyst for something larger than survival. Elias's silence forced Krishak into a spiral of self-destruction. The reptilian student's claws twitched as he glared at the human, his lips pulling back to reveal jagged teeth. He wanted to accuse, to lash out, to shatter the quiet authority Elias had assumed, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank into suspicion. Elias finally broke his silence, though his words were measured and deliberate. His voice carried clearly across the chamber, steady and calm, lacking the venom that might have come from someone eager for vengeance. "What surprises you so much?" he asked, his tone neither mocking nor aggressive, but piercing in its simplicity. The question struck Krishak like a blade, cutting through the noise of his panic. The crystalline cadet lowered her gaze, her angular body dimming as though trying to fade from sight. The insectoid student clicked nervously again, unable to hold Elias's gaze. His words had not accused anyone directly, but the weight of the question forced every cadet to reflect on his or her own reaction. The tension swelled as the room absorbed his calm challenge. Some cadets began whispering, but their voices held a new tone. Not ridicule, not doubt, but something closer to respect, tinged with apprehension. For the first time, Elias's humanity no longer seemed fragile. Instead, it seemed unknowable, carrying a quiet danger that none of the other species could easily define. Krishak took a step forward, his body trembling with rage, but one of the instructors raised a hand, halting him with nothing more than a gesture. The message was clear. This confrontation would not continue through violence. The instructor's silence was still intact, but their patience with disruptions had ended. Elias did not press further. He did not need to. The damage had already been done. The poisoned canteen no longer symbolized weakness or foolishness. It had become a mirror of arrogance, exposing the conspirators' ignorance and forcing the entire class to confront its assumptions. In the quiet that followed, Elias walked back to his place, his steps unhurried, his expression as calm as when he had first lifted the canteen. His silence now carried the weight of victory, and every cadet present felt it press upon them. The trap had failed, The conspirators had faltered, and Elias had emerged not only unharmed, but stronger than before. The instructors allowed the silence to linger a few moments longer before signaling the end of the exercise. The chamber's artificial sun dimmed slightly, the hum of hidden machinery shifting as the simulation wound down. Yet the lesson was not over, and Elias knew it. He could feel the eyes that followed him, some filled with shame, others with new respect, and a few with lingering hostility. The poisoned canteen had changed the balance within the class, and what came next would determine whether the moment became a fleeting shock or a lasting transformation. He did not smile, nor did he allow pride to show on his face. Instead, he sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze forward. The cadets whispered in hushed tones, but their words carried a different weight now. No one laughed, no one mocked. The silence he had carried with him into the trap now lingered with the entire class, reshaping the air they breathed and the way they looked at him. The poisoned water had not ended him. It had begun something none of them had anticipated, and the true lesson was still waiting to unfold. The moment the simulation ended and the artificial sun dimmed, the room should have relaxed into the usual shuffle of cadets leaving in silence. But this time, no one moved. The tension remained, heavy and suffocating, until it became clear that the instructors were deliberately withholding dismissal. Elias understood immediately what that meant. The test was not over. His act had shifted the center of the lesson, and now the instructors wanted to see how he would handle the aftermath. He sat quietly for a moment longer, then rose to his feet with calm composure. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, and every cadet's eyes followed him as though waiting for a verdict. He knew this was the time to break the silence and transform the spectacle into something greater than shock. Elias walked back to the canteen, not with hesitation, but with the same steady gait he had carried before. He let his hand rest on the container for a brief moment, not to lift it, but to draw attention to it once again. The faint glimmer of light across the metal surface seemed sharper now, as though the object itself had grown in importance. He turned toward the class and let his eyes move across each face, pausing long enough that every cadet felt the weight of his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm, carrying a clarity that pierced through the thick silence. "You wanted to see me fall," he said, his tone stripped of accusation but sharpened by truth. "You wanted to prove that I did not belong here. But what you do not understand is that the water you poisoned was never a danger to me. What is fatal for some of you is nothing to me. What is harmless to me might kill you. That is the reality of living in a galaxy of different species." His words carried no anger, only certainty, and that made them all the more difficult to dismiss. A crystalline cadet shifted uneasily, the angles of her body catching faint fragments of light that scattered like shards across the walls. She lowered her gaze as though unable to endure the steady calm in his voice. Elias did not single her out, but he let the silence after his words linger just long enough for the truth to settle into her chest like a weight. He knew some of his classmates had conspired against him, and yet he chose not to name them. He was not here to expose individuals. He was here to expose ignorance. He lifted the canteen slightly, tilting it so the water inside rippled and caught the light. Poison is not a universal truth. It is a matter of biology, of chemistry, of species-specific vulnerability. You believed that this liquid was dangerous because you assumed the world revolved around your own physiology. You thought what kills you must kill me. But survival is not about assumptions. Survival is about knowledge. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, not in volume, but in resonance. He sounded less like a student and more like a teacher who had seized the lesson from the instructors themselves. Krishak's eyes narrowed, his scaled body tense with shame and frustration. His claws pressed into his palms as though he longed to strike out, but Elias's words pinned him in place. The human's calm reasoning left no room for defense. Every cadet in the chamber understood that the reptilian student's arrogance had blinded him to the most basic truth of interspecies survival. Elias did not look directly at Krishak, but the reptilian cadet's jaw clenched as though he had been struck. Elias stepped away from the canteen and let his gaze travel once more across the room. We are here to learn survival, not sabotage. Yet in your eagerness to see me fall, you proved only how little you understand about what it means to survive together. If you poison a water source in a real environment, you endanger not just your enemy, but yourself. If you act without knowledge, you sign your own death sentence. His words echoed in the chamber, striking each cadet differently, some with guilt, some with shame, and others with dawning respect. One insectoid cadet raised a trembling limb, his mandibles clicking nervously. "You knew it was poisoned?" he asked, his voice quivering. Elias nodded once, his expression steady. "I suspected. The residue, the slight discoloration, it was enough to tell me something had been altered, but suspicion alone is not certainty. The choice was mine, and I chose to drink, because I knew what you did not. That what is lethal to one is harmless to another. I trusted my knowledge more than I feared your trap." His answer silenced the whispers that had begun to stir. The cadets leaned forward slightly, not out of curiosity but out of something closer to reverence. The instructors remained silent still, but their eyes betrayed interest. One of them folded his arms slowly, his gaze fixed on Elias as though measuring the weight of his words. Another tilted his head in subtle acknowledgement, a gesture so small it might have been missed by most, but Elias caught it. He understood then that this was no longer a simple exercise. This was his opportunity to redefine himself in the eyes of his peers and his instructors alike. He let his hand fall from the canteen and placed it on his notebook at his side. "Knowledge is survival," he said firmly. "It is not strength of claw, nor sharpness of blade, nor brilliance of armor that ensures life. It is knowing what can kill you, what can sustain you, and what can save someone else. When you choose to use ignorance as a weapon, you make yourself weaker. When you choose to learn, you make us all stronger." His final words carried a resonance that filled the chamber, leaving no one untouched. The crystalline cadet shifted again, her body dimming as shame weighed her down. The insectoid lowered his gaze, mandibles pressed tightly together. Krishak's rage simmered beneath his scales, but even he could not deny the truth. The instructors exchanged one more glance, and then, for the first time since the beginning of the exercise, one of them stepped forward. He wore armor that shimmered faintly under the dimming light, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the chamber floor. He did not speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was measured and deliberate. "Lesson understood," he said. It was not praise, nor was it criticism. It was acknowledgement, and in the academy, acknowledgement was worth more than applause. Elias bowed his head slightly, not out of arrogance, but out of respect for the moment. He knew the true test had not been to endure poison, but to respond with wisdom. He had chosen to transform an act of malice into a demonstration of knowledge, and in doing so, he had taken command of the lesson itself. He returned to his place without haste, sitting once again with his hands folded on his knees, his gaze forward. The cadets did not whisper now. They watched him with a new kind of silence, one heavy with reflection. The poisoned canteen remained where it was, still glimmering faintly in the artificial light. It was no longer a symbol of danger, but a symbol of ignorance overturned, of arrogance dismantled, and of survival redefined. Elias had not only proven his resilience, but had shown them what survival truly meant in a galaxy where difference was not a weakness, but the foundation of strength. When the instructor's brief acknowledgement faded into silence, the chamber settled into a strange stillness, not heavy this time, but contemplative. The poisoned canteen had lost its threat, and in its place stood something far more significant, a reminder of how fragile assumptions could be when measured against knowledge. Elias sat quietly at his place, his posture straight, his expression calm. He did not need to seek the eyes of his peers, for he could already feel their attention lingering on him. Something had shifted permanently in the room, and he understood it was not just about him anymore. It was about what the entire class had learned through his choice. The crystalline cadet was the first to move. Her refracting body dimmed to a muted glow as she lowered herself slowly, folding her limbs inward. The gesture was not merely one of exhaustion, but of surrender. She had been complicit in the plot, and the weight of Elias's words had pressed her into a silence too heavy to carry without acknowledgement. She lifted her head slightly, her voice soft and uneven as it carried across the room. "I misjudged you," she said. The words were not loud, but they resonated with a clarity that filled the chamber. The confession was both admission and apology, a surrender to truth rather than pride. The insectoid cadet who had clicked nervously during the exercise shifted uneasily, his long limbs curling inward. He looked toward Elias with wide, multifaceted eyes that shimmered faintly under the artificial light. His mandibles trembled before he finally managed a halting admission. "I wanted to see you fail," he said, his voice brittle. "But what I saw instead was my own ignorance." His confession rippled through the class, and several cadets exchanged uncertain glances. Few dared to speak, but the silence itself had changed. It was no longer heavy with suspicion or hostility. It was filled with the weight of unspoken acknowledgement. Krishak sat rigid, his scaled body taut with suppressed fury. His claws twitched against his knees, digging shallow grooves into the dirt. He did not speak, but his silence spoke volumes. His jaw was clenched so tightly that his teeth ground against one another, and his narrowed eyes burned with resentment. Yet even he, for all his pride, did not rise to challenge Elias again. He had been cornered not by accusation, but by truth, and truth was the one enemy he could not claw apart. Elias did not react to the apologies, nor did he respond to the silence of those who could not yet admit fault. He simply inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the weight of what had been said without demanding more. He understood something vital. His role was not to humiliate his classmates, but to give them the chance to grow from their failure. That was the true victory, and he chose not to taint it with arrogance. His calm acceptance allowed the cadets to absorb the lesson without feeling crushed beneath it. The instructors finally moved. The tall, armored one who had spoken earlier stepped forward once more, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. "You have all witnessed the power of assumption," he said. "You believed weakness where there was none. You believed your knowledge complete when it was partial, and you learned, through his choice, that ignorance is the deadliest poison of all." His words carried the authority of law, but for once, the cadets did not bristle under it. They listened, chastened and silent. Another instructor, smaller but no less imposing, added her voice. "Survival is not isolation. It is not sabotage. It is not arrogance. It is the understanding that every life form carries strengths and vulnerabilities unique to its kind. To survive together, you must recognize those differences and respect them. You will remember this moment not as a test of one student, but as a test of you all." Her voice was sharp, but beneath the steel lay a truth that none could deny. The instructor's words closed the lesson, but the atmosphere of the room had already been transformed by Elias's demonstration. When the dismissal finally came, the cadets did not rise with the usual haste. Instead, they moved slowly, each one lingering as though reluctant to break the fragile new balance that had been created. Some approached Elias cautiously, their words halting, their gazes lowered. A crystalline cadet bowed her head in silent respect. An insectoid cadet placed a long limb briefly on his shoulder before withdrawing quickly, the gesture awkward but sincere. Even those who did not speak carried themselves differently, their eyes lingering on him not with mockery, but with recognition. Krishak left last, his movements stiff, his tail dragging faintly in the dirt as he stalked from the chamber. He did not look back, but the tightness in his body betrayed the conflict within him. Elias watched him go without judgment. He knew resentment did not fade in an instant, and he did not expect gratitude from someone who had plotted against him. What mattered was not Krishak's pride, but the undeniable truth that the trap had failed, and its failure had changed the class forever. Elias walked out of the chamber in silence, his notebook still at his side. He did not smile, nor did he allow triumph to color his expression. What had happened was not a victory for him alone. It was a revelation for everyone present. The poisoned canteen had begun as a symbol of sabotage, but it ended as a lesson carved into the minds of every cadet who had witnessed it. The human had not only survived the trap, he had transformed it into something larger, something lasting. As he stepped into the long corridor beyond the simulation chamber, the artificial lights stretched across the polished walls, reflecting his steady silhouette. His footsteps echoed faintly, unhurried and calm. For the first time since his arrival at the academy, he did not feel the sting of isolation pressing on his back. He felt the weight of new respect, cautious but real, settling over him like a mantle. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but he also knew this moment had shifted how his peers would see him from now on. The poisoned canteen was behind him, but its lesson would ripple outward, shaping not only his place at the academy, but the future of every cadet who had witnessed what he had done. The test was over, yet the truth of it would live on long after the chamber's lights dimmed for the final time. Elias walked forward without hesitation, carrying with him the quiet certainty that survival was never about strength alone. It was about knowledge, understanding, and the choice to lead with wisdom when others chose malice. And in that certainty, he had already passed a far greater test than the one the instructors had set before him.